Every year, farmers haul bags, stack feed, and watch the price climb again. The plants pushing through their fence lines get pulled out every spring. They call them weeds. 9 of them can feed every animal you own for free every year without replanting. Stay with me for number 4. Pigs harvest it themselves. And number 1 carries a compound drug companies spent decades trying to replicate. 9. Lamb squatters. The plant you've been removing from your own food supply. There is a moment in late spring when you kneel in the garden, grab a handful of weeds, and don't realize you just pulled up a week's worth of free feed. The same plants come back every year in the same corners, offering to cover part of your feed bill while you pay someone else to do it. Lamb squatters has been feeding people and livestock for thousands of years without needing a brand name. It didn't disappear because anyone banned it. It disappeared when the perfect lawn and clean field took over. Once uniform turf became the goal, anything that broke that pattern was called a problem, and an entire generation started doing unpaid labour every spring to rip out one of the highest value volunteer forages on their land. For many small farms, the plant you've been pulling in April can replace a surprising amount of bought greens and roughage. It drops seed in the fall, waits just under the surface all winter, and comes back as soon as the soil warms. Most of the management is simply choosing not to pull it when it shows up in the same spots each year. Timing is where it stops being a weed and starts acting like a crop. Catch lamb squatters early, when it's still low and the leaves are soft and pale, and chickens, goats, and pigs go through it like you planned it that way. Let it shoot up, and the stronger bitter taste is something mostly the goats and pigs stick with. Flip a leaf over and you'll see a fine white powdery coating on the underside, a dusty bloom that separates lamb squatters from almost everything else in the same strip of soil. Once you see that, you start noticing how many of these plants are already standing on your land, waiting to be used instead of uprooted. Some plants trickle out feed, others hold back and then dump it all at once. The next one belongs in that second group, and when it lets go, your animals are standing in the middle of their own self-sown grain field. 8. Amaranth, the grain crop that plants itself. If you've ever stood in front of the feed aisle doing the math on grain again, this is the plant that starts to change that equation. Most small farms don't lack space or animals. They lack anything that drops seed on its own, survives winter in the soil, and comes back without another purchase. A mature amaranth throws seed heads the size of your forearm, packed with tiny seeds. Once those heads dry and shatter, the seed falls, sits in the soil, and waits. By spring, it returns wherever the ground has been scratched or turned, choosing its own spots instead of the rows you would have drawn. It's technically an annual, but it behaves like it belongs. You get 2 feed windows from the same plant. Early in the season, young leaves stand in for many of the greens you'd otherwise be cutting or buying. Later, the seed heads harden into a grain crop, giving your flock something close to what you'd normally scoop from a bag, only this version never saw a store. Amaranth doesn't need pampered soil or careful irrigation. It tolerates poor ground, shrugs off heat, and hits head height or more in a single season without fertilizer. Throw the seed into bare ground once the frost is gone and forget about perfect beds. If you've ever seen tall red seed heads along the rough edges of a field, you've already seen amaranth prove how little it asks from you. The only timing call you have to make is at harvest. Let the seed heads dry in place, take the whole stalk, and hang it over the chicken run. The birds turn it into a slow-motion grain feeder on their own, knocking seed loose, cleaning up what hits the ground, and saving you from threshing altogether. Keep the cycle going by letting a few plants finish and drop seed each year instead of cutting them all for leaf. Grain like this carries a farm a long way, but it still depends on rain and a growing season. One step further down this list, a different kind of plant takes over, one that doesn't care if the pasture turns brown and keeps feeding when almost everything else has quit. 7. Chicory, the root that feeds, when everything else quits. There's a point in a hard summer when the pasture turns into a faded rug, the animals slow down, and you start adding up how many bales you'll need to buy. Chicory reads that moment as a signal, not a disaster. The drier it gets on top, the deeper it drives its taproot. Farmers have used chicory as a main feed plant since Roman times, and that habit survived in European grazing cultures for centuries before modern landowners wrote it off as just another roadside weed. When rain shuts off and grasses stall or go dormant, chicory sends a root several feet into the soil, pulling up moisture and minerals from layers most pasture species never reach. And the leaves stay green and palatable while the rest of the field looks tired, giving you something that keeps feeding through conditions that would normally push you into emergency feed. Animals usually figure it out first. Cattle move through chicory without prompting, and goats and sheep Return to the patch with a focus that tells you they're getting something they need. Those bitter leaves carry compounds linked in studies to lower internal parasite levels, especially in small ruminants. Herds with regular access have carried lighter worm loads than those on straight grass pasture, turning one weed strip into both feed and part of a parasite plan. Drought and parasites grind slowly. The next plant fights in a different way, and you know you've met it when your first instinct is to pull your hand back and swear before you ever think about feeding it to anything. 6. Stinging nettle. The plant that defends itself and then feed everything. Almost everyone's first memory of nettle is pain. You brush against it, your skin lights up, and your brain files the plant under avoid this forever. That reaction isn't a flaw. It's the plant doing exactly what it was built to do. Most farmers who meet nettle on a fence line decide in seconds to cut, spray, or pull it. What disappears is a plant that has been solving problems on farms and battlefields for centuries in ways this bagged feed can imitate. In the First World War, when cotton ran short, German medics wrapped wounds in nettle fiber instead. Those bandages were tougher than cotton in mud and rain, and the plant wasn't just holding the dressing together. Its fibers were quietly leaking compounds into the wound and adding a natural layer of protection no one had to think. Nettle is a true perennial. Planted once into rich, moist soil, it spreads and increases yield year after year, especially if you cut it regularly. On a small farm, that makes it one of the few feed sources that becomes more productive the harder you lean on it. As long as you keep it in a bed you're willing to let it own. Give it a contained bed with a mow barrier, let it root in, then take 3 or 4 cuts a season in whatever form your animals will accept. After that, you spend more time deciding who gets each harvest than worrying whether it will come back. Just when you start to rethink what counts as a weed, you meet a shrub that whole villages once refused to cut without good reason because it fed their animals, carried their families through winter, and your livestock will show you why the first time they find it. 5. Elderberry, the shrub that feeds your animals and fights for them. You've probably bought elderberry syrup, small bottle, big price. The plant behind that bottle is a tall shrub that comes back every year and spreads along fence lines on its own. For a long time, families planted elderberry near the house because it kept helping. It fed their animals, gave them fruit they trusted when people were sick, and grew close enough to reach without leaving the yard. When something stays in people's yards and stories that long, it's because they watched it work. Put elderberry back on a farm and the animals explain the rest. Chickens ripe berries as soon as they fall. Pigs sweep the ground clean under the branches. Goats strip leaves and young shoots all summer before fruit even shows. The berries carry compounds that support the body under stress, but you don't measure doses. Animals eat what they choose when the fruit is in reach. One shrub becomes feed and simple health support at the same time. There is one line you can't blur: ripe berries for direct access. Large amounts of unripe fruit and leaves can upset the gut if they eat too much at once. Stick to ripe and dried fruit and normal browsing, and the plant stays in the safe zone. What changed wasn't the shrub, it was the habit. A labeled bottle is easier to sell than a hedge anyone can plant. Push bare root elderberry into the ground in spring and, a few seasons later, you can stand under more fruit than your animals can finish, while the store shelf still holds the same small, expensive bottle. Elderberry hangs its work where you can see it. What comes after hides everything underground, waits in the dark, and lets your pigs prove that a root can be both a crop and a self-serve buffet. For Jerusalem artichoke, the crop that harvests itself. Most harvests need your hands. You cut, carry, and guess at timing. With this one, your main job is to open a gate and step aside. Root crops are some of the hardest work on a small farm. Digging, lifting, storing, and hoping they don't rot. People living here long before us grew Jerusalem artichoke because it solves that. Any tuber you leave in the soil becomes next year's plant. The patch spreads on its own, year after year, without you standing over it with a seed bag. The animals best built to eat it are built to find it. Turn pigs into a bed of Jerusalem artichoke in fall and watch, head down. Snouts working, they move in rows, not chaos. They're following the scent of tubers, finding each one, digging it up, and eating it. You didn't plant those roots that year. You didn't fertilize them. You didn't haul them. You opened a gate and closed it when they were full. All summer, Jerusalem artichoke works in 2 layers at once. Tall stalks and leaves for chickens and goats above, and tubers putting on weight below. One bed gives you green feed in warm months and roots in cold ones without replanting. Jerusalem artichoke is powerful for the same reason it's hard to get rid of. Once it likes a spot, it stays. Give it a bed of its own and let that permanence work for you, not against you. You've seen a plant that hides its harvest underground and lets pigs do the lifting. Now we move to a tree that does the opposite, dropping food from above and stacking 3 layers of life under one canopy. 3. Mulberry, the tree that feeds 3 ways without being asked. Most fruit trees punish you for being late. Miss the harvest and the fruit ferments. draws flies and becomes another chore. Mulberry flips that on its head. Here, the mess is the point. Leave the ground under a mulberry alone for one season and watch. Chickens learn the drop zone and start working it before the fruit is done falling. What they miss, pigs clean up without a bucket or a caul. Whatever still escapes them sinks into the soil, feeds the worms, and pulls the chickens back to scratch through it again. This tree builds a small economy at its feet, with birds, pigs, and worms all running on their own clock. 3 levels of feed from one tree in one corner of your land, and the smartest thing you can do most days is step back. How long that pattern runs depends on variety. An ever-bearing mulberry spreads its fruit drop across much of the warm season, so the foraging under it stays active long after other trees have gone quiet. Plant it once, ideally as a bare root tree in late winter, and think of the first year as letting it take hold. After that, you're not scheduling harvest days. You're living with a tree that keeps throwing food into the same piece of ground, year after year. Even when no fruit is falling, the leaves carry protein and minerals your animals can use, and goats will stretch for low branches without being shown. That second window, fruit first, then foliage, sets mulberry apart from almost every other feed tree. Mulberry changes the scene under its canopy. Black locust changes the ground those scenes grow from, even as farmers spend money to have it dragged off their land. 2. Black locust, the tree that improves everything it stands near. On many small farms, this is the tree someone calls a crew to cut down. They pay for saws, machines, stump grinding, and then watch new shoots push up from the same spot. What they paid to remove was a tree fixing their soil and feeding their animals. Black locust was once one of the most prized trees in early North America. Fence posts made from it could sit in the ground for decades without rotting, so farmers planted it along field edges. Over time, they noticed that crops near those trees stayed stronger, and yields stayed higher than crops grown farther away. They kept planting because the results were obvious long before anyone talked about nitrogen fixation. Below the surface, black locust pulls nitrogen from the air and trades it into the soil around its roots. Every plant in that reach grows in richer earth than it would have had alone. Above ground, the tree works too. Goats strip leaves from reachable branches. Cattle graze fallen leaves. Chickens scratch through seed pods under the canopy. One living structure feeds animals and quietly raises the baseline fertility of that strip of land. It doesn't stop when you cut it. Drop a black locust hard every 2 or 3 years and it sends up a flush of shoots from the base, with young growth that carries more leaf protein than old branches. Managed as a row along a property edge, it becomes a living fence and a steady feed source in the same line. Some plants change what your land can produce. The last tree on this list reaches into the animal itself, offering something close to medicine from its bark and leaves, and your herd often knows to look for it before you do. 1. Willow, the medicine your animals have been looking for. There's a specific kind of panic when an animal goes off feed, stands apart from the herd, or just doesn't look right, and you don't know what to reach for. Most people think bottles, powders, or a rush trip to town. On many pieces of land, the animals already know a different answer and walk straight toward it. Watch closely when they have willow within reach. The goat that's been dull all morning pulls a branch down and works it harder than anything else. A cow along a wet fence line leaves good grass to chew bark instead. That isn't boredom. That's a body going to the one tree that doesn't just feed it, but eases what it's fighting. The same stuff that makes willow matter to them helped build aspirin. The tree packs a compound called salicin into its bark and leaves, and people figured out long ago that boiling that bark into tea calmed pain and brought heat down. Different times and languages, same discovery. When things hurt or run hot, this tree changes how it feels on the inside. On a small farm, you don't have to guess a dose or read a label. Give your herd access to willow and they take what they want, when they want it. You're not forcing anything into a mouth. You're giving them a living option they already know how to use. Willow doesn't want your best field. It wants the wet ditch, the soggy corner, the fence line that never dries. Push cuttings into that kind of ground, and they often take hold and push up fast. Cut them back every so often, and they respond with fresh, reachable growth that your animals strip before most other brush. You can leave those wet edges empty or full of plants that do nothing when something is wrong, or you can turn them into the place your animals head when they need more than feed. 9 plants, all simple, all older than the feed store, all either already growing near you or one season away. If any part of this made you look at your weeds and fence lines differently, hit subscribe and tap like so. The next farmer sees it before they write another check they didn't have to write. Tell me in the comments which plant you're starting with and what you hope it changes for your animals and for you. Every plant on this list was here before the first feed store opened, and they're still growing now on land like yours, waiting to be used. The farmer who puts even one of them in the ground this season becomes a different kind of farmer by fall. Not just because the bill changes, but because the dependence does. If this shifted something for you, pick one plant and tell me in the comments which one you're starting with. Then hit subscribe and tap like so. The next farmer sees this before they write a check they didn't need to write.